First of all, thank you, Turnkey. Thanks, Brad, you and your organization for inviting us to present this webinar with you guys. And thank you to all the attendees. I know it's not always easy to carve an hour out of your day. I hope that we make this interesting enough for you guys and give you some really good information. There's going to be lots of resources throughout the demo. So it's a great thing that it's being recorded because the slide deck is going to have lots of good information. So you're going to want to access that recording after the demo in case there's something that piques your curiosity and want to find out more about. So with that being said, we're going to get into Dynamics GP security from A to Z. And the things that we're going to talk about today are basically how you set up security in not exactly how you set it up piece by piece, but the elements of the security within GP, things to consider outside of GP. Other products that might connect into your GP system and securing those and making sure that your environment has proper security all around it. Unfortunately, too often we see that security isn't a huge priority when a system is being implemented. And I completely understand that. You're implementing a system, and so you're trying to test and make sure that you can actually pay your bills and service your customers and receive your cash and all of that. And so when you start running into security snags, you don't know if the software is actually working the way that you need it to, and you're under deadlines. And so what happens? Well, generally, we turn off some security features during testing just to make sure that we can do the work, right? And then we say, oh, we'll go back and we'll address how to tighten that security back down later. And then that never happens. Or over the course of time, security gets diluted, right? A user has a particular function within the organization, within their team, within their department, wherever. And so they're granted security. And maybe they might switch roles. Maybe they're going to work for another department, and rather than pull away their original security and give them new security, they might just get additional security added on, things like that. And so over time, security is an area where we don't pay a ton of attention to, and we really should. There's lots and lots of different stories that you can read out there. I'll tell you something locally, and this is not a scare tactic. This isn't, oh my gosh, you're just telling us this because, you want us to run out and do all these things with our security. Absolutely not. But it is things that happen on a daily basis. So every morning I log onto my machine and I get ready for the day and I have my cup of coffee and I read my local paper, which I live in South Florida. I live in a town called Coral Springs, Florida. It's right outside of the Fort Lauderdale area. It's kind of it used to be a sleepy little suburb, not anymore, but it's still a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. And there was an article, and it said, local woman arrested for embezzling $1.2 million from an insurance company. So security is my thing, and I was like, that's interesting. How did she do that? Well, she must have had all kinds of abilities within her system because she was able to change the bank account numbers where payments were being routed. They paid their vendors electronically via EFT, and she would enter in invoices to the system that looked like invoices that would be proper, right? She was paying vendors that actually existed. She wasn't just making stuff up. But the payments were being routed into her own bank account. So rather than inputting maybe just one invoice for the electricity for the month for their building, she would input two. One would go to FP&L and the other would go to her. She was doing this over the course of 5 years. And the way she covered up the $1.2 million going out was she had access to the customer's insurance policies, which were fully paid, but she refinanced them. Okay, and it was only when those refinances came due and people started complaining and all these other things was it figured out that she was doing this, right? So, and this, it took 5 years for her to get caught to the tune of $1.2 million. Now, I'm not sure if the company has recouped all of their losses. I didn't follow much into the story after that. And the reason why I read it is because she happened to be from Coral Springs and I was being nosy, wanted to know if I knew her. I didn't, thankfully. But, these are things that you read about every day in cities across the nation, not just Coral Springs, Florida, not just major cities, not just small companies, not just large companies. It happens everywhere. And so we really want to start taking into consideration, the way that we've set up security, and are we really protecting our company's assets? Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. So the elements of security that we're going to talk about is GP itself. Okay, and you see in parentheses either a GP or an AD, which means if it's GP, that's security right within the GP module. If it's AD, it's Active Directory security. So we have GP, and then you might have reports being run via SQL reporting services. So you have the ability to run SQL reports out of your data, and that's secured via Active Directory. You give permissions to the folders where those reports are maintained in Active Directory. You have Management Reporter, which is, the tool that some clients are using to write all of their financial reports, and that is also secured via Active Directory. And then you have, you could be using GP Workflow to, pass certain transactions into the system, and some of that security is also via Active Directory. And then you can have other things. You can have the web client. So the web client can be accessed via regular GP login, so regular GP security, or you can also be using an Active Directory login to access the GP web client. And then you might have other products that integrate into GP, Power BI, Smart Connect, RecLogic, Vicinity Manufacturing, all different kinds of products that may or may not have their own security modules, right? So these are all things that you have to take into consideration. How do you secure each of these pieces? How do you make sure that users have proper access so that they can be productive, but not too much access where they can, do things inadvertently even, not just maliciously? Okay, so you want to be able to protect your system and your assets. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to give you some tips, some tricks, give you some information on how best practices, etc. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about how GP security rolls up. Okay, and so basically you start with a window. Excuse my silly graphics, but it's just the easiest way to kind of illustrate. You have access to a window in GP. That could be vendor maintenance, it could be payables transaction entry, it could be transaction entry for a journal entry, things like that. All of those individual windows roll up into a task or multiple tasks. For example, you have a task called Maintain Vendors in Dynamics GP, and it includes the window called Vendor Maintenance. It includes the window called Vendor Address Maintenance. It includes the window called Vendor EFT Bank Maintenance, etc. And then those tasks roll up into roles. And so those roles could be something like an AP clerk, and within the AP clerk role, you can have a task such as Maintain vendors. You can have another task such as post transactions. You can have another task such as maintain vendor 1099 information, etc. You're going to roll all of that up into a role, and then you assign roles to users. Okay, so that's just basically the default security methodology within Dynamics GP as of Dynamics GP 10. Prior to 10, it was a different security structure. We did not use roles and tasks. It was what they called an open security model, where when you created a user, they were granted access to everything, and you had to restrict what they actually could see. And then the powers that be at Dynamics GP said, oh wow, that's really a bad idea. So let's move to a pessimistic security module. When you create a user, they are given access to nothing. And then you can go ahead and assign roles to those users to start to give them access to the system. Okay, and so from GP 10 all the way until current state GP 2016 R2 and beyond, this is the type, it's a role-based security module or model. Okay, now one of the things to recognize is that there are a bunch of default GP roles. Okay, so GP, when they decided to move to this pessimistic security model, the powers that be, the developers said, well, we can't expect that our users are going to move from an old version to the new version and then sit there and invest the time to build all these roles. That's a lot of work. So what they did was they went ahead and created a set of standard roles, and they made it kind of one size fits most. and broke it down into functional areas such as, AP, AR, sales, inventory, etc. Now, the problem with the default GP roles are some of them are okay and some of them are terrible. And it's very hard to run a report within Dynamics GP to get an understanding of what exactly is in every role. And some of those roles can have quite a few overlapping permissions. They have role conflicts, and what we mean by a conflict is having access to two pieces of the system where that combination could cause a risk to the organization. And sometimes when if you've converted your security, you may have leftover CNV roles, which are just the converted roles, and they really don't help anyone, okay? So if you want to have an understanding of the default roles and the tasks within them, this website right here is a free website that you can go to that gives you an access to a list of every single role and all of the tasks comprised within those roles. It's just an easier way of getting that information rather than trying to query that out of Dynamics GP yourself. Okay, so this is why I said at the end you're probably going to want to get to the recording to be able to get to all of these items to remember where they are. So this is going to give you the information of all of the out-of-the-box roles that exist within the system. So this screen is just going to show how you assign roles to a user. So I'm in my user security setup window. I choose my user, and for each company, you can give users different roles. You do not need to give users the same role in every company. So one of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but I'm going to bring up now, is segregation of duties, right? Some organizations say, it's really hard to segregate duties within our organization because we don't have a big staff. And we completely understand that. So we say, we do need users to have kind of, access to create vendors and access to pay vendors, but maybe they don't, maybe they're not allowed to create invoices for the vendors that they create. Well, one of the ways that you can do that is, let's say you have multiple companies and the volume of work is pretty evenly distributed through those companies. You can give a specific user access to create vendors in one company and create invoices in another, and then take another AP user and have them have the opposite access. They create vendors in the company where the other user can create invoices, and they create invoices in the other company where the users can create vendors. And so therefore, that's still segregation of duties at that point because they don't have overlapping access in the same company. Okay, so just one of those things to remember, you don't have to have the same roles in every single company. Just something to think about if you need to find better ways to segregate duties. Okay, but when you're assigning roles, what you're doing is you're assigning a set of tasks. Okay, and tasks really are the key. And the reason why we say that tasks are the key is because the default tasks out of the box in GP are pretty discrete. They're generally well designed. They include everything required to complete the task. So I don't know how many of you have ever taken the time to create new tasks or create new roles within GP, and you go in and you create a task and you think you're giving somebody all the access they need to do a certain function. And then they log in and they start to do their work, and the next thing you know, they hit a window that says, you do not have access to this window. And you have no idea what window that is because it could come up, let's say at the time of posting when they're trying to run a report, there's some crazy background window that's opening and you have no idea which one it is. Okay, that's the difficulty in GP security. The default tasks out of the box though usually don't have those issues. So they usually include everything that's required to complete that task. So what we say is use the tasks as your basis and then combine those into new roles. Because they are pretty good. You would just take them and, maybe create a new role that is useful to your organization, what your functions are, etc. So, and this is just an illustration of the task assignment. So where you assign the tasks to the roles. So for example, for the AP clerk role, these are some of the tasks assigned to it. So you can do that. You can see what roles are assigned to the tasks. And then there's this role in GP that we all love to hate and hate to love, and that's the power user. And the reason why we at FastPath do not love power user, and we highly, highly, highly suggest that if you're using this this role that you don't use it anymore, is because power user is not a role. Okay, a role gives access to tasks in Windows. That's what a role is supposed to do. Power user just is a security override. Okay, what it does is every time you open a window in Dynamics GP, there is a line of code that gets read by the system. It says, check the user security, see if they have permission to open this window. If they do, open it. If they don't, return that message that we've all seen before that says, you do not have permission to open this window, please contact your security administrator. Power user tells GP, ignore that line of code. It will open any and every window in the system. So the problem with that is that it doesn't appear on a security report. So if you wanted to run a list of users that have access to the vendor maintenance window and give that to your auditors because they're interested to see who can create vendors in your organization, everyone who's been given access to the vendor maintenance window via a proper role and a proper task will show up on that report, but your power users will not. Okay, you can give them a list of separate power users, but we just don't recommend it. You can actually create manually a super user role, and you can call it whatever you want. It could be super user, it could be power user 2, it could be, Batman user. We don't care what you call it, but basically what you do is assign every single role and every single task to that user. And so you can do that. There's this little download that you can go to here that gives you a snippet of code that creates that role for you so you don't have to sit there and manually click. Okay, so you can go ahead and have access. And I don't know if you're noticing this, but by every link that we have, there's brackets and it'll say free or paid. And that just means whether the resource behind that link is a free resource to you or if it's something that you actually have to purchase. And so far everything that we've seen is free. You can just go out there and, like I said, it's going to be a snippet of code that will allow you to create a super user without having to manually sit there and click. Okay. So power user is one of the things that, we don't love. Another thing we don't necessarily love, although it is a requirement for some very, very specific tasks, is having a lot of people have access to the SA account. So I can't see you guys out there, but if you guys were in a room with me right now, I'd ask to do a show of hands and I'd say, how many people in your organization know the SA password besides, the database administrator. And generally I get about half the room to maybe, a quarter of the room that raises their hand and says, yeah, we have quite a few people that know the SA password, or yeah, we probably should lock that down. Okay. The SA user is not required to add additional users for Dynamics GP. It's really only required for installation. Okay, there's a lot of myths around there about what you need to do as SA, and there are some third-party products that still require you to log in as SA. Now, Microsoft themselves have moved away from requiring you to use SA to do anything because they see that that is a security challenge and the auditors don't like that. So if you're just talking about base GP, the only thing that you really need to be logged in as SA for is an installation process. You don't need SA credentials to create new users, to assign security, to change security, anything like that. So there are a couple of free links here, again, that will give you some information on best practices, how to minimize the use of SA in a GP environment, and a little bit more information about what SA is truly required for within GP and what it is not required for. Okay, so it's just basically trying to debunk some of those myths that are out there. There's these two links that you can go to. And then the next type of user is the limited self-service user, okay? So these limited and self-service users have predefined roles and tasks to further reduce their built-in limitations. You know, a limited user is primarily a read-only with some limited transaction permission, maybe approvals or requisitions, and you can lock it down further to with tasks. So let's say you wanted to have just a purchasing limited user. You can certainly do that. So it does help to take advantage of some of those limited and self-service licenses that are available out there from Microsoft. Maybe you have everybody as a full user, but they're only logging in to do some specific tasks, maybe some read-only information, or maybe they're just doing you know, approvals or requisitions or using GP workflow or something like that. And you could probably change them to a limited license, thereby securing your GP environment further. Okay. So that's just something that you might want to look into. You know, Turnkey can definitely give you more information about the different types of licenses and how they are used within the system. So now we're going to move into other security items. Okay, we're going to talk about SQL Server, password management and resetting, orphaned users, you know, the system password, doing backups and restores and things like that. So, you know, we always think of GP as the product that we log into, right? We have the GP icon on our machine. We click on it, it opens up. We see all of the different windows and areas of GP that we have access to. Maybe we're an HR payroll user, maybe we're an AP user, maybe we're a sales user, etc. Right? We get our home page, we go to all of our shortcuts, and we seem to think that GP kind of ends there. But it really doesn't. There's an entire database behind it that contains the information, and that database is a SQL Server database. Okay, and actually I should say an entire server behind it, because there are multiple databases. You have your Dynamics database, you have your company databases, etc. Okay, so that system has to be secured as well. You have to make sure that somebody doesn't have access to your SQL Server incidentally, and it could be for many different reasons, right? They're the DBA in the organization, they're your consultant, so you know they need access to do a couple of things, so you give them access to the server, etc. You want to really evaluate who has access at that server level and what they can do with that access. And I'll tell you why. I'll give you a little story. I was a GP consultant ages ago. Okay, I stopped being a GP consultant because I was terrible at it. Because one of the things that I was doing is I was building an interface for my clients, and they needed to transfer thousands upon thousands of records into GP on a daily basis having to do with cash receipts. Okay, I accidentally dropped their entire customer table. Their RM00102 table, just basically I blew it up. And I'll never forget that day. I don't think anyone who is in my position would. And I freaked out and I said, oh God, that's it. I'm done. I'm fired. My life is over. You know, I'm just going to hang my head in shame and, you know, take my lumps, and that's it. But luckily, very luckily, I was working on a Saturday. We were doing a special project for them, and we had a backup, and I was able to restore, and all was good. But had some of those pieces not been in place, it could have been disastrous, right? And so that's why we want to talk about, you know, who has access to your SQL Server? What can they do on your SQL Server? Is it being documented? Are you making backups? Are, you know, is there a process in place, etc.? Because that becomes really important. You know, one thing goes wrong on your SQL Server side, and it can blow away tons of data. Okay, so that's something that you want to talk about. Password management within Dynamics GP. Dynamics GP out of the box doesn't have any inherent password policies. You can enforce SQL password policies. However, SQL password policies can be pretty clunky. A SQL password can expire in the middle of the day, in the middle of posting a batch, and then that batch gets shoved to batch recovery, and that causes problems. So you want to think of best ways to handle passwords. We have config AD listed here, identity management. That is a It does allow for single sign-on into Dynamics GP. Another tool I like to mention that is not on my slide deck, but I'm going to mention it, is Rockton has a toolbox, and within there there's some password policies where you can set a password expiration policy or a password complexity policy for your Dynamics GP password. So just a couple things to consider. The other thing to consider is orphaned users. So Dynamics GP is not Active Directory enabled. You have a SQL user ID and a SQL password, okay? That SQL user ID and that SQL password are specific to GP itself. So let's say a user leaves the organization and their Active Directory account is deleted, right? They're no longer with the company. They no longer have access to the network or anything on the network, etc. If there is no process to go and remove their user account from within Dynamics GP, someone can access the system based on that user, okay? Someone can go ahead and still access the system with John's credentials because nothing has deleted John from within the system. Nobody has removed him. Nobody has, gotten rid of that user ID. And so because it is a separate user ID and password, there could be an instance where somebody knows John's user ID and password and gets into the system and continues to do transactions or put in information as John. So you need to find a process to go in and clean up those orphaned users, because I will tell you that auditors don't love orphaned users. They are a liability to the organization. The reason why it says config AD and identity management is because those tools actually do offer what we call a disable delete feature. If the user is disabled in Active Directory, they will be disabled or deleted in Dynamics GP. Okay. So that's just some of the functionality that's included in the config AD and identity management tools. Your system password, okay, that's the password that you have to enter when you go to specific screens. You're creating a new currency, you're creating a new user. How often is that changed? How many people know that password? Okay, so you want to make sure you put some policies around that password as well, because it is just an extra security check within the system. And then finally, I talked about it a little bit when I was talking about SQL Server, but how often are you backing up and restoring your GP systems, or how often do you have access to a backup? Are you doing transaction logs every hour? Are you backing up nightly? A full backup, etc. How often are you? How long are you keeping that information for, etc. Because we've seen issues where we've had clients that haven't done any backups and they've lost, a few weeks worth of work. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. My husband came home 2 days ago, and he was just a mess. He was beside himself because someone had flooded the bathroom at work, and the bathroom sat above the server room. Now, we're not even going to talk about the poor design of the office or anything like that, but I can't, I always laugh because as a technology person and, working in the software field, I always laugh at the way that his company does business, and they're a very successful company and they're a great company, wonderful people. Their processes, their methodology, their infrastructure is a little bit, it needs to be revamped. And so when he came home, he was just like, Liz, we've lost all this data and we were down for the day and I had to send my people home and they couldn't do anything. And, it's scary because they had to go, their backup actually caused them to lose 2 days worth of data. The freshest backup was 2 days old. And they're a high volume shop, so they do a lot of things in the system each and every day. So to lose 2 days worth of data really, really put a kink in their works and made everybody not so happy. Okay, which is why they actually have some people coming in next week to kind of talk about how they can fix some of these issues that they have. But make sure that your backup and restore process is well documented, well executed, and easy to get to that information in case you have some sort of issue. Okay, so next we're going to move into talking a little bit about security design and why it's so important. And, design is not just what it looks like. Design is how it actually works. And so one of the things that you're going to hear us say over and over is you need to take a risk-based approach to your security design. Okay, so We've talked about all of the different elements of security, right? We've talked about the roles, the tasks, the different pieces that need to be locked down, but let's talk about executing a security plan. And that's really what I want to move into here when we talk about risk-based security. And so one of the things that I'm going to ask, and again, I wish, we were in a room together, just so I could, we can have a little bit of back and forth. But if I was to ask you today, what is the process for setting up a new user in your organization? I can probably bet that the process looks something like this for a portion of you guys. I won't say everybody, and I won't even say 50%, but I'm sure a portion of it is, well, if Jane is the AP manager and she's hiring a new AP clerk, she's going to send an email to somebody in IT and say, hey, we're going to set up Steve, just give him the same access as John. Okay. And it could be anywhere. It could be in the finance department, AR department. I pick on AP a lot, so I'm sorry for that. But regardless of the department, hey, Steve is joining us. Well, what kind of access should he have? We'll give him the same access as Tracy. Okay, well, what does Tracy have access to? I don't know, because when Tracy came on board, she was given the same access as Joanne. And Joanne was the AP clerk at one point, but then she was moved into AR, and then she was actually promoted, and now she's on the accounting team. And so she's had a lot of different access. And when she came on board, she was given the same access as Bob. So you can see how really you have no idea what you're granting security to when you're using that kind of a model, right? And if that's the way that you guys are doing things, I'm not picking on you guys, please, I know it sounds like it and I'm really not, but I'm just trying to illustrate, there are things that you can probably, sit there and say, oh, wow, we are doing things that way. We probably should take another look. And I strongly, strongly suggest that you contact, your contacts at Turnkey. They can help you with that process. They can help you use this information that I'm about to talk about, a risk-based approach, and really, redesign your security in a way that makes sense, in a way that protects you. Because really, that's what the end goal is, right? A healthy, functioning environment where productivity is balanced with, security, and everybody can do their job, but we're also certain that we have controls in place to make sure that, the system is being used properly. Okay, so what do we mean by a risk-based approach? Well, basically, we want to focus on high-risk business processes using business process maps. And what we mean by that is every company has its own risk profile, okay? And what I mean by that is Heineken, let's say, okay, they are a beer manufacturer and distributor. So if you take a look at Heineken's risks, it centers around the manufacturing process, spoilage, inventory, materials, transportation, moving of inventory from one place to another, discounts on sales in the distribution process, things like that, right? That's where a lot of their risk centers. It centers around the making of the product, the distribution, and the sales of the product. So their risk profile is going to look a lot different than Indeed.com. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with what Indeed.com is or does, but basically they're a website for both job seekers and companies that are looking to hire. And they post jobs on their website, and you can go and search for jobs. Or if I'm an employer and I'd like to hire somebody, I can post my job on Indeed. So Indeed's risk profile is going to look a heck of a lot different, right? Because they don't have a warehouse somewhere with job postings sitting on shelves, and they don't move job postings from one area to another, and they can't spoil or anything like that. Their risk is probably centered around the way that they recognize their revenue, around, the accruals that they might make, the sales that they have, the cash that's coming in, things like that. Okay, so their risk profile is a lot different than Heineken. So you want to have a good understanding of where your business risks lie. Then you focus on your high risk areas, and you sit there and you actually map the process. And I'm going to show you an example of a business process map on the next slide. But basically you sit with the individuals and say, okay, what do you guys do on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis? What part involves the system? What part is manual? And what you can do as you're doing that business process mapping is you can find improvements. Find where things have been done manually in the past that can actually be done systematically. It's a great exercise for an organization. It really is. Not only does it help secure your system, it helps transform your business into a more productive one. Okay, so then once you've gone through the business process mapping part, you identify the risks. Then what you need to do is also identify who should review those risks, who the reviewers are, and the periods that that this review should be done in. And so what do we mean by that? Well, there might be areas that you cannot adequately segregate duties, okay? For example, you might have to have a user have access to create a customer and actually enter sales for that customer. So you might want to review on a daily basis any changes made to customer credit limits to make sure that somebody's not issuing more credit than a customer is worthy of. You might have an area where you can, create journal entries and you can open and close fiscal periods. And maybe, you might want to have a report that gets sent out each day if a fiscal period was opened or closed, because you need to see that, make sure it was done correctly, because really fiscal periods should only be opened and closed at end of month. Maybe you have somebody who can create a GL account and then also do journal entries, but maybe you only have to review the creation of new GL accounts on a weekly or monthly basis because that's less of a risk for your organization. Okay, so it's determining those risk areas, who should be in charge of reviewing them. And what I mean by that is if I can change customers' credit limits, should I review to make sure that customer credit limits have been changed appropriately? Heck no. Okay, the reviewer should be somebody who has a vested interest in that process going correctly. Maybe the controller, right? The person who's getting the D&B reports and making sure that that customer is actually creditworthy, etc. So you want to determine who those reviewers are and how often those reviews should be done. And your users, your auditors are going to ask for proof of those reviews. To make sure that you're doing them. So you want to have some way, be it some sort of a report or anything that you can say, yeah, we've reviewed these areas, this is what we're doing. And then you may have to include mitigation. And what mitigation is at that point is where you can't adequately segregate those duties, what are you doing to control or mitigate those risks? So for example, you could be using workflows with approvals. And, this is the approval structure that we have. Anything over this dollar amount has to be approved by this person, etc. Maybe an audit trail tool is being used to, to keep track of areas. Maybe there's other mitigating factors. You're using safe pay. All kinds of different things can be your mitigation, right? Your mitigation is simply how you're alleviating or reducing that risk in your environment. So the next slide is going to be just an example of a business process map. So you start, with the customer, they place an order. Is this a web order? Yes or no? If no, you have your different steps. If yes, you go here, etc. So basically, it's just, a way to build your processes. And then from here, once you have that done, basically, we always talk about task-based design, right? You don't want to start with the roles, you want to start with the tasks because those tasks are more, they're better than the roles. So basically, you want to take a task-based approach and match the processes that you just mapped out against the built-in tasks and then assign them to the new roles. But if you don't, if you're not able to find a task that matches, you can certainly build your own. But we do say, take a look at the defaults because those should be pretty comprehensive. Now, we have a security matrix, and I've actually already issued the security matrix to Turnkey, and they're going to disseminate it to you guys after this webinar. And I'm going to show you on the next slide an example of what the security matrix looks like. And basically what it does is it allows you to go through and build new roles based on what you're found in your business process mapping, etc. Okay, and what you want to do is take a phased approach, and this is what we mean by phased. Let's say you have 3 or 4 different departments. You have AP, you have AR, you have sales, and you have purchasing, and then you have finance. Maybe you just start with the purchasing department first. Go through and change their security, because if there's issues, and there are going to be issues and you are going to have to test, it's easier to handle phone calls from 3 or 4 users saying, hey, I can't do this or I can't do that, and tweak their security and then make sure that you get it right before moving on to the next group than having to handle calls from all of your GP users at once. Okay, that can be a little bit overwhelming. So we always say take a phased approach. And so the next slide is going to show you what this security matrix looks like. And basically you have your roles going down the side, and you can split it up, based on the different areas, etc. And then you have your different tasks. And we break those tasks down based on the way they're broken down in GP. Cards, inquiry, transaction, utilities, etc. Okay, and then you go through and say, okay, for this particular role, what do they do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? Let's go check off these tasks and build a role for them. So this matrix will be disseminated. It has been updated for GP 2016 to include any new roles and tasks, so you have full access to that, and this will certainly be of assistance if you need to do a security redesign. Okay, and then once you've created your new roles, okay, you need to review them. Okay, you need to check your roles and your user setups for segregation of duties conflicts, and basically the reason why you should do that is just to make sure you don't have a huge overlap. Okay, so we do offer a product. It is called Assure, and basically Assure contains a comprehensive list of auditor-built conflicts for GP. It's assigned to report on security and identify both user and role conflicts, so you can see where you might have way too much of overlapping security in each role. Okay, so that is a tool that's out there. Now, nobody's sitting there saying you absolutely have to do it. You can do it manually, but you would then have to come up with your own conflict listing, and you would have to then go ahead and do your own segregation. This does it automatically. It's very quick and easy, but you do want to go ahead and review those roles and make sure that they're not giving too much access. And some tips on doing your review: 0 conflicts equals 0 productivity. Okay, it's not reasonable, and you're going to produce inefficient processes. You want to be able to have your people work. You just want to be able to make sure that there isn't too much risk. Okay, and then you also want to make sure that if there is areas of risk, that you can mitigate it in other ways. It's not necessarily pulling all their access away from them within the system. Maybe it's putting external controls on what they're doing. Okay, and all security design should have sign-off. And so we suggest that you do the security design in a test company. You don't even need a separate test environment, because remember, I told you that each company can have their own security setting. So you can do your security design in a test company, and you should have somebody, maybe, the business process owners from each group, or maybe, one person who's in charge of security, go ahead and sign off on all of that. So you definitely want to make sure that you're doing those sign-offs. So basically, the process is going to be, pretty easy. You're going to create the new roles. You're going to apply the task to the new roles based on the matrix. You're going to assign those roles to users, temporarily preserve existing roles, meaning when you see that, the roles are working, the old roles that you might have in your system, you don't want to delete right away, because you might have to go back to them temporarily if you're still tweaking things. And again, take that phased approach. And then after that, you certainly want to test. So you want to verify the roles. You want to do this in a test environment. You want to phase these changes. And then if you're using test companies, you just copy the security from one company to another. If you're using a test server, though, okay, so if you do want to do it in a completely separate environment, there is a blog post on how to transfer security and roles and tasks between systems. So you don't have to redesign it all over again in your live. So we do have the link here that will teach you how to do that. And then once you've done that, of course, you're going to want to offer support. You're going to have to expect delayed issues, because there are going to be tasks that don't happen every day. Maybe it's something that they only do once a quarter and they didn't really think about it, and so then they go and do that, and it's going to, show up maybe 2 months down the line. So you're going to have to do that. And then you're going to have to be ready to either approve requests to change security. Maybe something was designed, incorrectly, or it didn't take something into consideration and you're going to want to change. or you're going to want to alter the process. Okay, maybe a user doesn't have security to something, but you really don't think that you should just grant them security. Maybe something in the process itself can be changed. Okay, so and this is where phasing security really helps. If a single department has issues, it's much easier to fix than if something is missed for all users. Okay, and then there are some security tools out there that'll help you. It used to be called the support debugging tool. It's now called GP Power Tools. This is a paid tool. It's not free. You get this through your partner. But it's a suite of GP utilities that includes security tools. It helps you when access is denied to try to understand what is being denied, and it helps you with security moves between servers. So the next, and this is just where you can download this. The next slide just shows some of the things that you can do. So for example, this is showing, where things have been denied, which window you haven't given access to, et cetera, so that you know which window to give access to as you're doing your testing. And in real life, this isn't a fast process. This is a project. However, to keep that into perspective, failures in internal controls are incredibly expensive. So if you embark on a 3-month project to clean up your security, that's going to be infinitely cheaper than the $1.2 million that's been embezzled. Or, we had one of our new employees was hired to help a public company with the GP side of a control failure, and the money that they spent on consultants to fix the control failure because they were publicly traded was staggering. So, that's just really something to consider, okay? It's penny wise and pound foolish. Just be very careful in saying we don't have time for this, or we don't have, it's not high on our priority list. You might want to consider the fact that if it isn't high on your priority list, what could potentially happen if you do have a failure in control. And it's not, not all risks have to be addressed via security. Don't forget your mitigation options. Don't forget your controls. Don't forget about field level security. Okay. Don't forget about using an audit trail tool. So these are other things that you can look at. Field level security comes in handy when you need to give access to a specific window. We always talk about vendor maintenance, right? Because the vendor inquiry window is terrible. It doesn't show you all your information. So people like to give access to the vendor maintenance window so they can see what they need to see. Go ahead and do that, but then use field level security to secure the most important parts of that vendor maintenance window. And so now we're just going to talk very quickly about the other items that tie in. So, SSRS security, it's Active Directory based, and basically you're just giving access, what type of access, whether you're a browser or a content manager or a publisher, and which folder, they should have access to. So, what they need access to actually get those reports. Management reporter security, it focuses on limiting users who can create reports. You can use AD groups and users, and there's some, in the permissions granted area, there's some additional control of whether or not you can drill out to dynamics, whether or not you can have access to the dimensions, etc. So you can certainly secure this down further. So this is just a little bit about the management reporter security. GP workflow security, you have, it uses Active Directory. You need to set their email at the Active Directory level. Okay, and so managers are going to have the right to actually do this. So this is just an example of GP workflow security. And then web client security, you can use AD to access web client. And then you can have users that are not SQL users, they're just web client only users. However, those users cannot access they cannot access GP from the traditional window. So for example, if you set up a user that's web client only, they're not going to have access to GP classic client, the regular client. Okay, and then finally, you want to consider other integrating systems. Anything that isn't allowed in GP shouldn't be allowed via third-party product. So, for example, if the user is restricted to not being able to create a journal entry in GP, then you shouldn't have them be able to import an entry via a third-party product, right? Because then you're just kind of circumventing the GP security. And then last but not least, this is just a very quick slide on the different tools offered by FastPath. I'm not going to go through all of these in very comprehensive detail. Assure is just our segregation of duties analysis tool. It's after you've built your roles. It checks your conflicts. Our audit trail tool is a monitoring tool. It checks for any changes that you set up. It'll tell you the before, the after, who made the change, even where the change came from, so we can track changes that happen outside of GP. And then we talked a little bit about Identity Manager and Config AD. This is just ways to provision Dynamics GP using single sign-on, using Active Directory, etc. And if you'd like to know more, you can always contact Michelle at Turnkey. So this is the contact information. We are having a special as far as, you can take 15% off for the next 30 days if you're interested in any of the FastPath tools. And remember to download this webinar once it becomes available so that you have access to all of that other content that's in here. The matrix will be sent out, but all of those other websites and tips and tricks are going to be available there. So with that being said, Brad, I'm going to turn it back over to you for any questions and answers.
Hey everybody, Brad here. Yeah, we did get some questions, Liz. The first one is, when someone terminates and their username is still active, can they access GP from their home computer, or does it require access to the network?
It depends on how GP is installed. If they have GP installed locally, and somehow it's using a service account to establish a SQL connection to that database, they certainly might be able to. It really depends on how GP is deployed in your organization.
Okay. Question number 2, what type of performance impact does an audit trail tool have on our GP system?
Two variations to that answer. One is it depends on the tool. Each tool functions a little bit differently, but the key to any successful audit trail implementation is really understanding that you don't need to audit everything in your system. You don't want to audit everything in your system. Your users aren't going to want to review the reports if you audit everything in your system. You really want to take that risk-based approach and choose the items to audit based on where you have overlapping duties.
Okay. Number 3, how often should we review our security setup?
That's a great question. If you haven't done it in a long time, you want to do it immediately. Okay, that's just something that you want to look at. And then after that, I would say that quarterly is a good measure for when you're starting to go through the process, and make sure that it's being addressed. And then once you feel like you've gotten into a very good place and you're no longer provisioning users based on like, hey, give them access to what Steve had, but you're actually using the roles and the tasks, you can then go to every 6 months to a year.
Okay. Can I audit something that has already happened? I know some things have changed last month and I want to know who did it.
Nope, unfortunately not. There is no looking backwards, unfortunately, and so that's why it's really key to have those systems in place, really upon deployment, but, we know that that doesn't happen all the time, but as soon as possible, because unfortunately, once something has happened, it's very hard to go back and find out how it happened or who did it.
Okay, and last question, we only have a few users. How do we handle segregation of duties?
That's a great question, and that's really, that really is the case for a lot of GP companies, right? They only have a handful of users. So at that point, relying on conflict mitigation and looking at your conflicts isn't going to be the best because you're probably going to have conflicts all over the place. That's where using field level security, using an audit trail tool, separating maybe by company. So if I can do transactions in company A, I can't set up master records in company A and vice versa. Things like that where you can utilize those types of things to really, kind of come at your requirement to have overlapping duties, right? Not every, like we said, it's not always possible to segregate as best as we'd like. So you have to look at the external mitigating controls that you can potentially put in place. Workflow is a great thing for companies like that as well.
Okay, and we did get another question here submitted. If you use MEM, and that's multi-entity management,
Yep.
I believe, can you
Yep,
set up? Yep. Can you set up security by flow, or do I need a separate role for each flow, i.e. AP clerk for one entity, another AP clerk for another entity. I have a small team where one individual will be AP for one entity and sales for another entity.
So unfortunately, I'm not 100% familiar with the MEM structure, but I do not believe that you can limit a role to an entity, unfortunately. I do believe that using the entities, you can limit what pieces of the entity you can see, like which clients you may see for a specific entity, or which vendors you might see for a specific entity, or which GL accounts, but I do not believe that you can assign roles at the entity level. Now, that might be something that you might want to suggest to Binary Stream to see if they have a way to, alter their model, because that would be, that would be fantastic. But in current state, I don't believe it's possible in MEM.
Okay, that's it for the questions as of right now.
Okay, cool. And actually, Brad, I have some contacts at Binary Stream. I can shoot them over an email too and see what they say, because that's a really good point. Being able to assign security at entity level rather than at company level with MEM installed.
Okay, sounds good. And yeah, Megan, we can get back to you on that, or you can reach out and contact us to discuss it further. And that wraps it up for the questions.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. I think we're all done here with just about a minute to spare. So I do certainly appreciate everybody coming, to learn a little bit more about security. I hope this session was very informative. And Brad, thank you guys so much again for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Liz. We appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.